Hello and welcome to The Double Life. I'm John Boostar, and this week we head to Brooklyn, New York, and sit down with journalist and war correspondent Ben Anderson. Ben has covered everything from the war in Afghanistan to ISIS fighters, drug lords, and migrant camps around the world. We discuss many topics and get an inside look into a world that not many get to explore. Enjoy.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of came out of nowhere. I mean, my family weren't at school. We weren't reading newspapers every day. The house wasn't full of books. Journalism wasn't something that was ever, even thought of as an even vague possibility. And then when I was about 17 years old, I think I started reading, political stuff and mostly about foreign affairs. So I read about the Indonesian invasion of East Timor and British support for Indonesia. I read about Iraq, Afghanistan, Congo, Israel, Palestine, and I just, I was stunned that what I was reading just seemed so urgent and important to me and so shocking. I was amazed that it wasn't part of, daily conversation with anyone really. I was amazed it wasn't front page news every day. And I started reading about some of the journalists who I'd been reading and reading about their lives. Just, I think for the first time in my life, I thought, I could do what they do. I mean, I never imagined I could be as good as some of the journalists, especially some of the writers, who were just so good, and still don't think I could get to their level. But just in terms of, having the stamina and the empathy and the curiosity to just get out there and get somewhere difficult and spend enough time there to really figure out what's going on and form relationships and hear people and get them to trust you and really open up and tell you everything. I just thought, for the first time ever, I kind of thought, A, there's something I could be good at, and B, something which could be, somewhat useful because then, I mean, back then, if a foreign affairs documentary aired on the BBC in England, it felt like half the country would watch, and it felt like something might actually happen as a result. I mean, I forget how old I was now. I think I was about 11, but when Feed the World and the running to raise money for the famine in Ethiopia, it felt like journalism and books and articles and documentaries actually led to action and help. And I think without realizing it, I've been looking for something like that my whole life, something you could do where you could actually help. And, things like being a lawyer or a doctor were never an option. That was just never discussed as even, potentially on the horizon at any point. And journalism felt like something where I could use what I had, which was, I had a little bit of, physical toughness and bravery, to actually do something productive and useful. So yeah, that's what got me into it. And I always wanted to be a writer to begin with, and very much stumbled into documentaries a few years after I'd started trying to be a writer.
And was that something that you wanted to pursue in school too, when you were, I guess that's a young age, 11, 12. And you grew up in England, right? Just for context.
Yeah, in Bedford. So, a small town just about 20 to 27, I think, miles north of London. And yeah, it wasn't until I was about 17 that I sort of thought, I was aware of documentaries and projects that had helped when I was younger, but I wasn't really aware of what war correspondents or foreign correspondents did until I was, 17, 18, or investigative journalists. I was reading a lot of John Pilger at the time. I was starting to read a bit of George Orwell. Those were the people whose just incredible lives just really spoke to me. And I think also a part of it was a way of getting out of that small town that I was in. And the expectation then was very much, get a job that probably bores you, probably does nothing for the rest of the world, but pays a decent salary, and that's as good as it gets. On Friday, you go out and enjoy yourself. And on Saturday, you watch, football live in the pub with a hangover. And on Sunday, you rest and have a Sunday roast. And then you start again on Monday. That was it.
Right.
So reading about people like Orwell and Hunter S. Thompson and Martha Gellhorn and others just made me think that there was a, much bigger life was possible. And a bigger life where you could actually do some form of good, hopefully.
Right. No, it's amazing. Was it supported by your family and community? Was it something that was seen as oh, wow, go for it, Ben, that's awesome? Or was it, almost a weird little like a pipe dream, like, oh yeah, go ahead, but we know you'll be back, blah blah blah.
I mean, to be honest, I don't even remember talking to anybody about it. I mean, it was I didn't really fit in with school or the town I was in. I was kind of lost, and I was kind of angry, and had tons of energy, but I had nowhere to put it. And I discovered books at the age of about 17. I mean, I read Nietzsche and Charles Bukowski and Henry Miller, and I read the autobiography of Malcolm X, weirdly. So I was like a 17-year-old spotty, skinny white kid in a small town in England.
Mm-hmm.
But just reading about him and his life and thinking, well, his starting point was so much, less than mine. He was a illiterate, drug-addicted burglar in prison when he discovered books. And he copied out the dictionary, from A to Z, and would read all day. And then when everyone went to bed, he would, lean up against his cell door and would use the light from the hallway to continue reading. And then, a few years later came out of prison and pretty soon became one of the most important, powerful intellectuals in America. And it just really lit a fire under me. And I just thought, if he can transform himself that much with so little, then you have no excuse. And I actually tried to copy out the dictionary, the A to Z, just like he did, but I didn't even get through A. But the books it was just such a private world to me. And I kind of felt like for the first time ever, I thought there are people, and most of them are actually dead, but there are people who understand me and who are putting my thoughts into words and articulating what I'm feeling and what I'm searching for and what I want to do. But it was very, very, very private. I don't remember talking to anybody about wanting to be a writer or a journalist. I mean, even when I started writing articles and submitting them, and even when I got my first job, which was going undercover to make a documentary, it was still very much a little private thing, and I didn't really have a network of friends or colleagues or peers that knew anything about that world or had anything to do with that world to help me. And to be honest, part of the reason I managed to get these jobs in the first place was because the TV industry then was so sort of upper middle class to upper class, and they were educated and they were smart and all kinds of things, but they were not streetwise at all. So when I managed to meet a few of them and start auditioning or applying for these undercover jobs, they thought I was this kid from the streets who knew about all of the scams and the crimes and what was going on, and I wasn't. I was like 80% of people in the UK. But to them, I seemed like, I had all of this street wisdom. So that's what enabled me to get these jobs going undercover. And that's what eventually led to the jobs, traveling the world and making documentaries about Afghanistan and Israel and everything else.
Right. It's amazing. Was the, I guess the whole concept of keeping it private, was there any reasoning behind that? Was it just something that you almost cherished in a way, the same thing with reading, as something that you thought was very personal to you and kept close to your heart? And, even with successes and accolades that you had early on, there wasn't a part of you that wanted to, I guess, share that with other people. And what do you have any idea why that stemmed from it, or was there something was the nature of the beast?
Yeah, I mean, it was just the world of books and journalism and foreign travel just wasn't a world that anyone I knew had any connection to or knowledge of or passion for. It really did feel, and that maybe I was trying to protect something that I thought had to be kept the way it was when I first discovered it. But I just remember, nights where you had no money, no prospects, nothing exciting on the horizon. But I would make these big pots of coffee and just sit there for hours reading these books. I remember reading Crime and Punishment, and I read it in like 3 nights. It was difficult to get into, but once I got into it over the first 50 pages or so, I would just sit there and read for hours and hours and hours. And I don't know, I mean, maybe subconsciously I just thought that's how it worked. It's just between you and these long dead authors, you get this amazing bond and all of these discoveries. But yeah, there was no one I knew to share it with. And then the people I was talking to within the journalism world, I just thought were so much different to me, so much smarter than me and better educated. And it was, I think that's why it felt like it's such a solitary act for me. It was just, like I said, it was just never even discussed as a possibility that you could do something creative and somehow make a good living out of it as well.
Right.
Which actually you can't. It's very hard to, you've got to be prepared for years and years of not making much of a living to maybe make a somewhat decent living.
Yeah.
Although that's changed slightly, now I've been living in America 6 or 7 years. I remember every year. It just happened on the BBC. They'd publish everyone's salaries, and they'd be outraged that, certain famous newsreaders were getting paid £300,000 a year. And that, that's obviously a fantastic salary. But in America, you've got guys who have never really traveled much at all, and never really done much what I would consider to be, real serious journalism. And they're getting paid like $10-15 million a year. I mean, it's just off the scale. Right. But that's, that's TV anchors rather than journalists.
Yeah. You ever look at like modern day? Staying on that topic just briefly, it's just the concept of, kids growing up these days are, very, very far and in between going to have a very similar story as to you. I think a lot of people growing up now probably don't even know who Dostoevsky is or Crime and Punishment in his books. And they would look at that book and be like, I would not even attempt to read it because of how big it is. And, does that you ever think about that in the concept of, technology becoming something that's now the forefront of people, receiving information, and now books becoming something that's almost like an archaic in a way?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the amount of times when, I'll mention a book that I assume everyone, even among young journalists, I'll assume everyone has read, and sometimes they haven't even heard of the book.
Right.
I'm primarily a documentary maker. I've written one book and one ebook, but I've made, 70 or 80 or something documentaries, but I still respect books far more than I respect documentaries. There's always compromises with a documentary. There's always tons of good information left out. But a really great book. I was just talking to friends yesterday about King Leopold's Ghost by Adam Hochschild. Just the most perfect book of history that I've ever come across. I just love that book so much. But yeah, it's not just kids who are addicted to their phones. It's adults. How many books on average do people read per year now? I've heard that it's literally a handful of books that people are reading each year, and it's such a shame. And I'd go even further and say, is it even articles are being read these days? I think 60% of people are getting their news from Facebook, and I get sent stuff all the time. I'm friends with lots of veterans that I spend time with in Iraq and Afghanistan, and lots of them are very pro-Trump. So we're always getting into arguments about issues around that, and they'll send me these articles saying, this proved there were 3 million fake votes in the last election, or watch, Ben Shapiro own the libtards in this debate. And I'll read the article or I'll watch the video and I'll think, did you actually watch it before you shared it with me? Because it doesn't say what the headline says at all. I think you shared the headline, or someone you like shared the article and you saw the headline and you then shared it. And that was it. I remember when I first moved to London, I was 20 years old, I think, 19 years old. And I remember I had a clunky old laptop, and we were just getting into the internet for the first time. Where you'd really spend hours a day, doing things on the internet, and just like you'd read an article and you could click on a word you didn't know, and it would give you the definition. You'd click on a name from history, and you'd read the Wikipedia page about that figure, and it was like a joyous thing to just discover so much and go down these mad paths. And people just aren't doing that now. They're not spending 10 minutes Googling something that they're actually willing to get angry about and go out on the streets and shout about or argue about. And they're not learning the basic facts about it. It's terrifying. And a really discouraging time to be a journalist, because you can feel like, you're preaching to the choir, and people that agree with you say, oh yeah, wonderful film about the Saudi bombing of Yemen, Ben, great. But they already know that, and they already feel that way. So are you actually changing anyone's mind? Are you actually showing anyone something that they didn't already know or have an opinion of? It's easy to be dispirited right now.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, going into a field that is, like you said, very discouraging in a way. I guess the one thing that I really, held close to my heart with the reasoning why I wanted to do it, and I think I read or saw in an interview that you had a very similar idea, was just the concept of wanting to change the world and help out people. And I think when I went to the Middle East predominantly, and just seeing an underdeveloped third world country as opposed to America and, all the different things associated here that we have and we just take for granted, going to a place like that and just seeing the people and how loving and caring they are, and then coming back here and seeing how, the Middle East, not just Pakistan, but, all over the Middle East, and how it's portrayed on Western media, and, just the, general consensus of how people in America feel about the Middle East. And
Yeah.
how, for me, I was like, well, that's my people. That's where I come from. And that
Yeah.
90% of the people that I meet are the most loving, caring, humble people who don't
Yeah.
have shoes on their, feet, but are so happy with their lives. And we have people here that drive around in Ferraris and shove antidepressants down their throat, and it's this very interesting parallel of how happiness is viewed, and how, I don't know, just how, I guess, media portrays different things. And for me, that was one of the goals that I wanted to do. I was like, I want to change that, and I want to make an impact. And I think from the time that I set out to do that and to now, it's been a very somewhat discouraging thing, but also something that is inspiring to be like, hey, I got to keep going, keep fighting for it. And as someone who's farther along in their journey, and as someone who initially did have that same intention, how do you feel about all that?
I think it's you've got to keep going, and you can never predict or target the impact any work you do has. But I agree with what you say completely. When I was in the UK, I was reading all of those, militant atheist books, by Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris. And I loved all those books and was getting into those arguments with people all the time. I've come to America, and like you, I've traveled, across the Middle East, spent most of my working life in Muslim countries, and even people on the left here, like Bill Maher, will say things that basically imply that all Muslims are kind of secretly ISIS, but they just won't admit it publicly, or they won't admit it yet until they're in power. And you think, how on earth can these people say such? And you say, if you get to debate with them, you'll say, well, how many Muslim countries have you been to? And of course, they've never been to any.
Right.
But so I ended up going from this, being one of these militant atheists to someone who was defending Islam and Muslims all the time here. But yeah, that leads to quite an interesting debate. I did the Joe Rogan podcast a while ago and didn't really have any idea what I was letting myself in for. I hadn't really listened to it much before. But I was in a bit of a dark spot at the time. And I think I said, yeah, I really wonder if my work has had any impact whatsoever and done any good whatsoever. And I wonder if it's even worth continuing. I think I said something along those lines. And loads of people sent me messages saying, oh, Ben, I've been watching your work for ages, and it's helped me understand this and that, and it's raised awareness. And that's great. And you love to hear it, obviously, but you do question what good raising awareness alone does if some subsequent action doesn't then take place. And I think my goal was always to help the actual people in the countries that I was reporting on. And if you look at it through that lens, then I'm not sure. You could argue that all of us together, as in everyone covering, let's say, Afghanistan's maybe a good example. I don't know. Maybe things would have been worse, or people would have got away with things had we not have collectively reported on what a failure the war in Afghanistan has been. But how much have we really actually helped, Afghans in Helmand or Kandahar or Ghazni province or wherever? It's easy to think you're not helping much. And a couple of times on reporting trips. Once in, I think it was Nicaragua, we were in a child malnutrition clinic, and once in Gaza, where we were filming a bunch of houses that had just been bulldozed by the Israeli military. And both times, someone just came up to us very angry and said, "You journalists, you come here, you're probably getting paid really good salaries. You get your pictures, which are going to get you plaudits and awards back at home, but you do nothing for us. So basically, we don't want to talk to you." And I think that's a perfectly valid argument, and I didn't have much of an argument, back. So that's there's the two different impacts. Yes, especially in America, you do need to raise awareness on all kinds of things, because I'm still amazed by how many Americans, aren't even curious about much of the rest of the world and say things about Muslims, for example, which are just so obviously wrong. But then you would actually like to help, the countries you're reporting from in some way, if possible. And that's what I find it hard to believe in sometimes.
Yeah.
Often.
What is, what does the help in those countries look like for you, essentially? Would it be like a UNICEF kind of thing where it'd be kind of just staying in those countries and helping out? And then, that would take away from the whole journalistic aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to do both. And you know, I've got lots of friends who work for medical NGOs, you know, UNICEF, Save the Children, and they'll say the same thing that I'm saying. And they'll say, oh, Ben, yeah, thank you for what you do and raising awareness to millions of people. I'm saying, what do you mean? I'm not doing anything. You're directly feeding people or saving lives or whatever. So maybe it's just a mindset where, you know, no matter what you do, you're always going to question how much good it actually did. And maybe that helps you keep on going and keep on, you know, trying to improve. I don't know. I don't know many people that even people that are doing real good, like, you know, surgeons for MSF or emergency or something like that. I don't know many that really, you know, go to bed at night and put their head on the pillow and just think, man, I'm really making the world a better place.
Yeah.
But you know, maybe that's just part and parcel of doing anything like this for a living. I don't know.
Wow. I think you touched on the whole Joe Rogan podcast, and I think that was one that I watched and listened to. But I remember one thing that you said that was pretty remarkable is that you guys were talking about how like one big global thing would need to happen to kind of shake the senses of the world and kind of change the perspective of how we view things, and sort of viewing that, and then everything that's happened this year, it was almost like a time teller kind of crazy, you know, future prediction kind of thing, which I thought was absolutely insane. I guess pedaling back to that and what you were sort of discussing as far as, you know, some one big event to kind of change global ideology and different things like that and people's viewpoints on things. How do you feel like this year has kind of impacted that, and has it impacted, you know, your work and, you know, kind of?
Yeah, it hasn't. I mean, the only impact it's had on me is it's just forced me to stay in one place for 4 or 5 months for the first time in my adult life, which is good and bad. I mean, it's good, you know, it's, I guess it's healthy in the long run, but I am feeling sort of a bit useless and a bit restless. I mean, I'm developing a bunch of good projects, but I haven't actually been out and done anything for a while. So and especially when, and this is how everyone's feeling, I'm sure, when, you know, you wake up and kind of think, how is today different to yesterday? You know, and how excited can I really be about reading yet another book and watching yet another, you know, drama series about Mexican narco traffickers? But I don't know. I mean, I think I'm like hopelessly optimistic a lot of the time, and that can never be fully crushed. But then I think I'm, you know, often, I don't know, disappointed by what actually happens. I mean, you'd hope that this would, and I think in many cases it has. You know, there are all kinds of local volunteer groups who are doing shopping for the vulnerable and elderly. Some restaurants have done an amazing job of giving, you know, free food to health workers. But you're also seeing some real selfishness and nastiness and stunning ignorance as well. I mean, you know, people. I mean, it even got to England the other day where there was a huge march that filled Trafalgar Square of people claiming that the coronavirus is a hoax. I met someone in Ohio just a few weeks ago who said it's all a hoax, and as soon as Biden gets elected, coronavirus is going to go away. He's going to hand power to Kamala Harris. She's going to hand power to Nancy Pelosi. Nancy Pelosi is going to try and take everyone's guns away, and then there's going to be a full-on civil war. Wow. And I said, like, full-on civil war, like two standing armies shooting at each other. And he said, yeah, absolutely, it's coming. Trust me. Jeez. And he was, and then, you know, you see armed militias taking government buildings. You know, you've seen people going out and actually shooting people dead. I mean, often you see these guys that sort of dress up like they're special forces. You know, I mean, they're like in the middle of a city wearing camouflage and with tourniquets, and it's just fucking, they look ridiculous. And it's easy to make fun of them. And often they don't look like they're in the best of shape. So the special forces look really isn't a good look for them. But you know, in the last few months, they've been shooting people dead. So I don't know. You know, I mean, I think everyone says this stuff is too dramatic and it's not going to get that bad, and then suddenly it does. And it's, you know, serious people who have lived here their entire lives have said they're really worried about what could happen. I mean, let's say the election is close, you know, in November. I don't think Trump's going to accept it. I don't think a lot of Trump supporters are going to accept it. And what happens then? Yeah. It's a scary, scary time. And I used to read about. I read all of Hunter S. Thompson's amazing coverage of the Nixon years, and I always used to sort of think. I was talking to a friend of mine about this the other day. I was thinking, what an amazing, fascinating time to be alive. To see all this happening day to day. It must have been so interesting to be alive in that period. And then you're actually living through a similar period now. And I don't know. I wake up in the morning and I'm sometimes scared to pick up my phone just to see what's happened. I mean, just as things couldn't get any worse, we found out Friday night that Ruth Bader Ginsburg has died, and no surprise whatsoever. Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham and the others are going to be complete hypocrites and try and push through a nomination 5 or 6 weeks before an election. It's every time you think it surely this next bad thing can't be as bad as it could be, and then it is. And also another really negative effect of COVID and Trump is, American coverage of the rest of the world or interest in the rest of the world used to be pretty slight. I mean, I would say 95% of the news on TV and probably, I don't know, 85% of the news in the papers was domestic, and the rest was foreign. And the only serious foreign coverage was, if a plane went missing or the blast in Beirut got a few days of coverage, but that was about it. And it feels like this year the coverage of some major crises happening in the rest of the world is just not getting covered at all. I mean, I've been covering the war in Yemen for 5 or 6 years now. I haven't heard that mentioned anywhere, and that's a war that could not be fought without US support and weapons and planes and servicing and targeting. Syria is as bad as it's ever been, and maybe 1 million people have died there. I covered Burkina Faso at the start of the year, a place where over 800,000 people have had to flee their homes because of Al Qaeda and ISIS and several other armed groups, and I've barely seen that covered anywhere else. So it's a really bad time for hoping that Americans in particular will have an interest in and care about the rest of the world.
And that does, I mean, for someone who has covered, many parts of international, Afghanistan, Yemen, let's see, Iraq, Syria, you've done even, in Africa, Latin America, other parts of the world that, is kind of the general basis. You don't do much. I mean, as far as I've seen, a lot more war corresponding is being done overseas. Do you ever come back here and see, something that you just saw that was so impactful and important, and, just the lives that are completely torn apart in countries that are, destroyed in a way by something. And then you come back here and you don't see any conversations about it, and a lot of people don't even know about it. Is that, in a way, very disheartening and sometimes eye-opening?
Yeah. I mean, Syria is a good example. I've only been to Syria 3 or 4 times. I didn't really cover Syria in the same way that a lot of my colleagues covered Syria, but some of my friends were there for years, and they were getting footage of entire buildings being destroyed with people in them, of babies killed and maimed in the worst ways possible, and sometimes those pictures did get on the front page of newspapers here and there, and what have we done? We've even got people now saying maybe Assad isn't that bad, and maybe we should do a deal where he stays in power and isn't held accountable. It's wow. I know that a number of my colleagues were kind of broken by that, because in Syria alone, I've had a few friends that were kidnapped. A few colleagues, they weren't close friends, have disappeared, and some have definitely been killed. Some, we don't know. People really gave everything for that war. I mean, Afghanistan, two friends lost at least 2 limbs covering that war. And you've now got Mike Pompeo, smiling next to the leader of the Taliban. And everyone knows that the war in Afghanistan should end with a political settlement, and there's not a military solution. Right. But it feels very much like we've done an agreement. We've reached an agreement with the Taliban, and we're leaving no matter what. So even if they don't reach an agreement with the Afghan government, who I think we've humiliated by sidelining them until now, even if the Taliban don't have guarantees on women's rights, for example, it feels like we're leaving anyway. And, you know, in America, there are, I think, 2,600, 2,700 American deaths in Afghanistan, hundreds of billions of dollars spent. And, you know, we're leaving very much with our tail between our legs and having not achieved any of the goals we claimed we were on the verge of achieving for years and years and years. And again, it's barely creating a ripple here. And you know, we could leave and have a partial or even near complete Taliban takeover soon after we leave. And, you know, let's say Trump wins re-election, that could even not hurt Trump that much. You know, one of the worst things about the Trump era is you start having the thoughts that you imagine him and his supporters having. So I can imagine Trump getting a second term, the Taliban taking major cities in Afghanistan and maybe even Kabul, and, you know, his supporters and him saying, "Who cares? They're you know, they want to kill each other. They'll always kill each other. There's nothing we can do about it. We're not the world's policemen. Leave them to it," and that being the end of it.
Wow.
You know, yeah, I can absolutely imagine those things happening.
Yeah, it's heavy. That's extremely scary. And I think as someone who's, you know, gone over there, it's definitely something where for you, when you know, touching on, you know, all the dangers and different things associated with the stories that you've done, and you told a few of those stories on the podcast you did with Joe, like even in the beginning, touching on, you know, being with the Marines and getting ambushed and, you know, having friends that you've lost and friends that have been badly injured and seeing, you know, death and violence. How has that impacted, I guess, you know, going into it in the beginning when you talked about wanting to get into journalism, you were sort of, you know, physically a little bit stronger, braver, and you wanted, you know, you were quote unquote like the street kid, you know, that kind of knew his ways around it. When you, I guess, initially started reporting on those countries and saw that kind of stuff for the first time, how did that, I guess, change your perspective on journalism and what you set out to do initially?
I mean, it's a strange thing. So I remember very early on when I looked at, you know, some of the people I really admired, when I actually got to see them in real life. You know, some of them were clearly had PTSD. Many of them were alcoholics, and it was obvious that you know, that could easily be an outcome of doing this for a living. And very early on, just as I was starting, a photographer gave me some brilliant advice and just said, "Look, Ben, no matter where you go and no matter how poor you are, you have to go somewhere beautiful and peaceful for 3 or 4 days afterwards. That is as important as your camera and your notebook. You know, even if you think you can't afford it, you need to do it." And I remember thinking then, that's great advice. And I've honestly almost never taken that advice, because there's a dangerous, maybe it's just me, I don't know. I think my colleagues have the same thing. There's a dangerous thing where, because you've got a return ticket in your pocket, because you know that no matter how bad things you get, at some point you're going to be in a nice room with a shower and water and food and you know, support and money, that you completely dismiss any signs that it's having a negative effect on you, because you compare yourself to the people you're covering in Afghanistan or Syria or Congo who have nothing and are trying to raise families in the middle of all of this, you know, violence and turmoil. And that's why I think so many of the older journalists I referred to before were drinking so much just to you know, block out any signs of bad effects it was having on them. And that was definitely the case with me for a very, very long time. And then I think it was getting worse because 2 or 3 friends, colleagues, and my dad all reached out, and you know, I mean, especially with English men, you know, you don't really reach out very often and say, "You doing okay?" Because you don't seem like yourself. You're sure everything's good. So when 3 or 4 people did that and said that, I was sort of forced to think, okay, hang on a minute. Like you've been doing this a long time. You've never really taken a break. You've never really, you know, looked after yourself or put yourself first at any point. So maybe it's time to do it. And you know, very quickly got a diagnosis of PTSD, and even then denied it. I mean, I think in the end, we made a documentary about MDMA therapy for PTSD. So in the end, I was in contact with, I think, 3 different therapists who all said within 5 minutes of meeting me that I clearly had PTSD. And I was still kind of in denial, because there's a guilt of thinking that, you know, you've suffered because of what you've seen, because for the most part, you are just seeing other people suffering. It's not you directly suffering. So it's very easy to dismiss it and think, well, whatever little issue I might have is nothing compared to all the people I've seen and spent time with. But yeah, I had no choice at that point. And actually the only reason I did get help in the end was because a new producer had arrived at Vice called Stephen Bailey, and we had a meeting where he was going to pitch his first few ideas. And one of them was covering this, MDMA therapy for people with PTSD. And my hand just went up and I said, I'll do it. And I'll do the therapy as part of the documentary. So it was a way to get help, but also at the same time to continue working and to continue being productive.
Right.
And that was that was the only way I was able to actually spend a bit of time, focusing on this and trying to get some help. But yeah, it would have been very easy to continue being in denial for years and years and years. And I deliberately, I barely drink now, but I deliberately avoided doing stuff like that, which could probably make it worse and make you, bury it even deeper.
Yeah. Do you think if that opportunity wasn't presented in the form of, for lack of a better word, like work, as a story that you had to go work on with Vice, do you think you would have sought out that treatment and that therapy?
No, I don't think so. I mean, a couple of times I spoke to people. I've got a friend who runs a really good charity that gives veterans free therapy if they think they have PTSD. And I did have a conversation with one of the therapists. I said, friends reminded me that I did a screening of one of my Afghanistan films way back in 2008 or 9, I think it was. And there'd been some real close shaves in this documentary. I'd very nearly been blown up and shot a few times. And apparently I said during the Q&A afterwards, yeah, I think that's it for me. Like I had some real close shaves on this one. And I think, being right at the front for these things is just not me anymore. And that was 11 or 12 years ago. And my poor mum, I mean, I've every time I say to her, oh, yeah, I think I'm thinking about going to, Costa Rica for a month and learning how to surf. And she'll say, yeah, sure, Ben. Like, you've been saying that for years and years and years. So even taking a nice, holiday somewhere like to Costa Rica, I wasn't doing. So no, I don't think I would have sought that help. And, I think, one of the places where a colleague pointed out to me that I just wasn't right was Mosul. And Mosul was really bad. I mean, it was house to house fighting. There were, heavy civilian casualties. There were 3 journalists were killed while we were there. We saw ISIS bodies everywhere when we were with the Iraqi army. I just wasn't. I don't think I was in a good position to make good decisions. I wasn't in a position to ever say, no, this one's a bit too much. We should go back. It was always, you have to go forward. You have to say yes to everything possible. You have to push to spend more and more time in the most intensive places because that's what you do, and that's why your work is good. And anything short of that, and you're softening or you're faking it or and I was pushing like that. And I remember times when I was running across roads knowing that I was going to get shot at, and there was no adrenaline rush, no fear, no nothing. I just didn't really care. So it wasn't like I was scared and was just so committed to journalism that I did it anyway through bravery and commitment. I just didn't really care. And I think that could have ended very badly.
Wow. And was it just not a care of dying, or was it something that you didn't even think about?
Yeah, that was before each trip, before you get on a plane, you think about everything that could happen. And the 2 or 3 days before you get on a plane, you don't eat right, you don't sleep right. And you imagine, I've imagined 1,000 times what it's like to step on an IED and realize you've lost your legs, because it's happened to several friends. Once you're actually out there, you're just, or I at least was just in this machine mode of just go. And you would occasionally stop, or you wouldn't even stop yourself, while you were walking towards that place where you're going to take part in this crazy operation or crazy patrol. You might think, okay, this is stupid. This is going to get bad. I remember in Iraq, I was with one of the Shia militias who were about to take Tikrit from ISIS. And one of them was really trying to persuade me to take a gun. And he was saying, look, this is going to get crazy. There's going to be a lot of deaths. Like, you really need to be able to defend yourself. And I was trying to explain to him that as journalists, we can't carry guns. It just doesn't work that way. Mm-hmm. But there are moments along the way there where you think, okay, this really could be the one where you finally get hurt or worse. But I mean, the word that came up all the time when I was doing the therapy is numbness. And I was just really numb to taking on board how bad that could be. Mm. It was a thought that popped up, but then was dismissed very quickly.
Wow. I guess initially when you started doing journalism, it was more of like an undercover sort of journalism, and then you did work with BBC, and you published stories, and then eventually you started working with Vice. I guess just touching on that a little bit, how did that whole process look, and your growth as a journalist, and as you've done more stories, and I think initially doing more, not necessarily war stories as much, and then 9/11, and then Axis of Evil, and all that kind of led to a trajectory of, I guess, where we are now.
Yeah, I did stuff. The undercover stuff was, as I explained, because I was streetwise compared to most of the people in the TV business. I did that for, I think, 4 years. I worked with a very famous presenter who wasn't very streetwise. So I kind of appeared alongside him a few times here and there. And I think the controller of BBC Two saw me appear alongside him once and said, I like the kid, like, ask him what he wants to do and see if he's got any ideas. And that's what led to the Holidays in the Axis of Evil. And because we were going to Iran, Iraq, North Korea, Syria, Cuba, and Libya, you couldn't walk around with a full camera crew and lights and boom mics and all of that. Yeah. So it was just me and one other person with a small handheld camera that could have been, a tourist camera, and partly by design, but partly by accident, we sort of invented this slightly new method of making documentaries in those kind of places where you never saw me standing in front of the camera, doing a rehearsed, polished piece to camera as I put my hands together in front of me. We never did any of that. Mm-hmm. We never interviewed officials behind desks with flags behind them. It was very much a kind of a from the streets up feel, and everything from me was either interacting with people, and it was interacting with people, while we were doing things or having dinner or walking somewhere, or they were showing me something. There weren't many sit-down interviews. Every time I spoke to the camera, it was an intimate aside where actually I was talking to the person behind the camera and there just happened to be a camera between us. So it's a slightly new style of making that kind of documentary, and it worked really well. And I did series of that. We covered all the conflicts along the west coast of Africa. We did Axis of Evil. We did a few others. And then I went to Afghanistan, and that was in 2007. And that was, as you said earlier regarding something else, that was just one of those cases where what we were being told was happening and what was actually happening was so far apart that was it. I was just focused on Afghanistan for a good few years, and then went back to doing all of the other conflicts around the world. But that was the motivation, was just, the situation on the ground here is so bad, and yet at home we're being told it's great, and the British soldiers are patrolling without helmets and handing out sweets to children and rebuilding schools and mosques, and the Taliban are almost finished, and it was complete bullshit. But then at the BBC, it's a big organization. I think it's really losing its teeth journalistically, especially television, and they had a very patronizing view towards young people. The amount of people back then that would say to me, to get young people watching international current affairs, you need your films to be no longer than a music video, because that's a young person's attention span. Wow. And I just thought that was so, patronizing and insulting. And then, I think Shane at Vice, Shane had been talking to me over the years and trying to get me to join Vice. And honestly, I didn't take them seriously at all for years. But when I actually met Shane one-on-one in Los Angeles for the first time, and he just basically said what I just said about, the patronizing view of young viewers. And he said, I think that's bullshit. I think if we make great content from the rest of the world, then young people will watch in droves. And that very much became the case. And I think that was a large part of Vice's success then. And I did one film about what happens when the US Marines hand over to the Afghan security forces, and how drug taking, kidnapping, theft, corruption, and the abduction and rape of young boys is extremely common. And the BBC version, which I think was called Mission Accomplished ? I actually had stuff not in there that I really thought should have been in there. I mean, partly for time reasons, it had to be no longer than 28 minutes long, but partly because some of the language in the filming, for example, me and this Marine confront an Afghan police chief who justifies child abuse in the most lurid language you can imagine.
Wow.
I mean, beyond locker room talk, just like the worst language you can imagine to describe raping young boys. And the BBC just said, look, Ben, even though it's just words, it's just too graphic. We can't include that.
Yeah.
And then Shane said, put it out there word for word. And it was in there like the first 3 or 4 minutes of the film. And the film was 28 minutes long for the BBC and I think 85 minutes long for Vice. And it went to a few festivals and it won a couple of awards. And that's when I just thought, actually, like Vice right now is a place that's going to give me complete freedom and believes in what I can do and believes that this information is so important that even if we make an 85-minute long documentary about, corruption and child abuse in Afghanistan, then people will watch it in their millions. And then that's how I felt as well. And people did. I mean, some kid put that video on YouTube and it's had like 6 or 7 million views. And then there's the Vice News viewers and elsewhere. So that was when I left the BBC and came to New York and joined Vice.
Wow. And what year was that roughly?
2000. I've been doing stuff for Vice. I had a deal where I did my BBC film, and then 2 months later, sometimes I would do a Vice version of the film. So I'd come to Brooklyn for a week. Shane or Eddie or someone would interview me, and we'd cut that interview with my footage, and they were fun things to do. And it got me to Brooklyn for a week here and there. But it wasn't until 2013, I think, when I actually quit England and moved over to Vice and joined full time and became a staff member. And then they just got the deal to do the Vice on HBO series, so I became part of that team. And then really just wanted to make feature length documentaries, but ended up spending the best part of five or 6 years making mostly 15-minute films, which is, it's great. HBO is the perfect place to be, and loads of people watch your work, but it has been frustrating going to some of these countries and then having to cut the film down to 15 or sometimes 30 minutes. I really want to get back into the long form stuff.
Yeah. What I think is, I've been a massive fan of Vice for a long time. I actually interviewed Thomas. I don't know, Thomas Morton.
Yeah, I know Thomas.
So I talked to him, I guess a month or so back. But I guess just the concept of Vice magazine and, originating as a magazine, and, by 2013, they were getting the whole HBO thing and taking off as a platform. And I think what Shane and, Sarush and that whole company of people that started that, how they intended it to be and where it is, as far as an organization and a news outlet that does very much appeal to the younger audience, and sort of what we were talking about earlier as far as, the younger generation of people not being able to read a book or, still having that access to news and stuff outside of social media. I think Vice did a very, very, impressive and amazing way of doing that. And I think what
you said did past tense, and I'm hearing that from a lot of people. A lot of people are saying you need to get back to what you guys were doing a few years ago. Sorry, I interrupted, but yeah, a lot of people have said what you just said.
Well, I mean, do you feel like that way as well? Do you feel like it has changed in the years? I mean, 2013 when you joined and it was on HBO, and now it's been 7 years, and I believe it is no longer on HBO. It's on Showtime now, and stories and stuff have changed as well. But I think, what I was going to say more or less is just, the concept of journalism in the sense of directly showing you something as opposed to telling you something is what I think is, ultimately the most credible way of journalism. It's very hard to argue something if you're directly looking at, something.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
As opposed to someone behind a desk telling you something, showing you a picture and some footage that they may have created, in some way. And that is the beauty of, and I like to say, Vice and how they do it, but I think with your form of it's always been, the ones that I liked the most and I felt were the most impactful. And I think another journalist I really like is Isabel Young. I feel like she does a really good job of that as well. And I don't know. We touched on it with Thomas as well. Just, the concept of Vice changing in a little bit as a company.
I think there's a real danger. We're hiring lots of people from, CNN, NBC, ABC, and there were all kinds of things that had to be professionalized about Vice. There were people in powerful positions there that just weren't qualified and didn't know enough to be in those positions. And there were shoots that were chaotic as well. But there are also plenty of us who did really good work and had really good ethics, journalistically. I think the strength of our work was that we were allowed to do what we wanted to do, and the pieces were authored and had individual styles and voices. And I think there's a danger that the professionalization of Vice means you lose that. I've had a few little battles with people here and there where, for example, they want a script before you go somewhere. Yeah. And my argument is always, look, we can't do what CNN does, where you fly somewhere with your piece planned out already, and then you find the 3 or 4 people that are going to confirm what you found out when you were Googling about this and researching about this. And then you pack up and go home. That's the exact opposite of foreign reporting. It's almost worse than not foreign reporting, because it gives the impression you went out there and did the legwork and found out what was going on and then reported it, when that's not actually what you did at all. So there's a balance, and I hope the balance ends up being, correct. But yeah, I am worried that show me journalism that you talked about. And I think gonzo, people, because of Hunter S. Thompson, people often assume that the word gonzo means take loads of drugs and get into chaotic situations, then write about it afterwards. And actually, if you read Hunter S. Thompson's journalism, he's a brilliant journalist and a brilliant writer. And the drug stuff gets a bit boring after a while once you've read his journalism. So, you can still have that gonzo approach that I think people loved in the beginning, and still be, ethically very strong with the stories you tell, and still tell really important stories about Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere. But it's a balance, and I worry that some of the people coming from the mainstream news networks are thinking they're coming in as the grown-ups, and there's not much that the old Vice people have got to say, and they certainly should be left alone to do things as they've been doing things in the past. And I hope that doesn't end up being the case, but there are hints that might be the case, which is worrying, because I think you really would lose what was best about Vice's documentaries if you did that.
Yeah, and very much, I think, a network or a company that is different from any other news outlet, in my opinion, as far as someone who's grown up. And I've always loved Vice, and I loved Vice before I was even into journalism. When I was just a normal whatever, studying whatever I was studying and going through life and the motions, if you will, I was always amused with Vice and how it was a little bit more raw and uncut and unfiltered in a way that that sense of professionalism is there, but in a different way from what you would see at, the New York Times or whatever. It's something.
And also, it was just capturing verite. I mean, so many people pretend they're getting, real documentary footage when you can tell it's been set up. You can tell they've just got the character they've just interviewed and said, "Oh, let's walk around outside for a little while and let's pretend we're doing something." You can't fake that. And I'm amazed at how many people still haven't understood how you capture real verite. You've got to make sure you're in the right place at the right time, and you've got to hang around. And you've got to, get a relationship with whoever you're filming with to the point where they've almost forgotten that you're there or why you're there. So you can actually film real life unfolding. Right. And there are journalistic outlets that I love, like The Atlantic, like ProPublica, like The New Yorker. But in terms of video, there are still very few people doing what we did best in terms of there are documentary makers doing it, sure, but in terms of people like putting out news documentaries on a regular basis, I'm amazed at how few people can still capture real verite. And I'm probably exaggerating to make a point, but often they think verite is, okay, you sit down, do the interview with someone, and then then you walk up and down the street outside the guy's office for 10 minutes and have another little chat outside, and that's it. That's the documentary footage you get. Yeah. Axios, I love some of the stuff that Axios do, but sometimes their verite is like, oh, let's get the journalists to sit in a desk in a room before the interview and film them pretending to have a chat before they do the interview. And that's not verite. Verite is getting access to people who trust you enough, where even when things are going completely wrong and could end up being disastrously wrong, you're still able to follow them and film it, and you're filming them confused and lost and trying to figure out what to do. And that's what we did so well. I think people responded to. And yeah, I'd hate to see us lose that.
Yeah. Speaking on that amount of trust that I think it's very apparent in your stories, and the people that you talk to are, I mean, I don't know, it may be generalizing in a sense, but I feel like the other outlets would almost be too afraid to go talk to these people, and maybe they don't have the access to, or maybe they don't have, the level of clearance or whatever. Because I think Vice tends to do stories that very much are almost jaw-dropping just to hear about where you're going, to interview members that were part of ISIS, or to stand, and to be part of like a resistance group that's getting shot at and different things like that. That level of trust must be insane, because it's almost, letting them into a world where they are so vulnerable to allow you to have that amount of truth, because it is very unfiltered, and they don't have lines that they're going to say or a script or anything. They're going to say what they feel and their emotions. And also, as someone who doesn't necessarily look like any of the people that are over there, how did that level of trust and, what does that sense of responsibility look like for you?
I can only speak personally, but I tend to use how bad some of the other major networks are to my advantage. So if I'm somewhere where I know that people have turned up for 3 hours and got the quick shot of them on the front lines with their flak jacket on, and then been back in the hotel in time for dinner, then I'll turn up and say, look, I want to spend 5 weeks with you guys. And I want to sleep where you sleep, and I want to eat the crappy food you eat, and whatever you go through, I'll be right here going through it as well.
Yeah.
And they do really respect that, and often, especially when if you're talking about U.S. Marines or rebels or whomever, they don't really care about the bigger political struggle or the bigger policy goals that might be going on or being discussed elsewhere. They just really appreciate you wanting to spend enough time with them to see what their life and their days are like, and see what they're struggling with. So sometimes that helps get that relationship. Sometimes the last time I was in Yemen, we were in a child malnutrition clinic, and we filmed some really, really shocking scenes. And I don't think any other journalist had been to this town, because the town was literally surrounded by a minefield, and there were Houthi snipers that were shooting people fairly often. So even aid agencies weren't sending aid in. But just the fact we managed to get there, and this, we did all the stuff you'd normally do. We filmed people working, we filmed the head doctor, and you could see there was this young nurse off to the side, just like itching to talk. And we kind of, nodded and said, hi, how you doing? Introduced ourselves. And she said, look, I'd like to say a few things. So I said, sure, of course. And we sat down, and I don't remember asking that many questions. I think they were really basic, simple questions. And she just gave this monologue about how the world has abandoned Yemen, and how the war there is just causing so much suffering amongst everyone. It's one of the most intense things, one of the best things I think I've ever recorded. But just the fact that we managed to get there and just gave her a voice for 30 minutes was worth going all the way there just for that. And that's what you're looking for. And then, the danger of doing it on the BBC News, CNN model is you're going to turn up and say, okay, I need someone who's going to say death to America. Who believes in death to America? Great, there's someone over here, and then you leave. Mm-hmm. And you don't talk to that person off to the side who's actually got something really interesting to say. And that's why I love obviously news and covering the big events of the day, but it's you're telling news stories in a documentary style. So that's why you've got to be willing to turn up and discard almost all of the research you've done, and actually pay attention to what people in the middle of it are saying is important. But that takes time. That takes days of just having tea and lunch and sitting around and waiting for people. It takes days when you don't get very much, but then every now and again you just get the stuff which you think is so important to get. And then you need the freedom to be able to get that and to be able to go in a completely different direction to the one you thought you were going to be going when you first got on the plane. And that's obviously, it can be costly and it can take time. So you need someone who's really supportive and trusting to be able to do that. And there aren't many organizations in the world that will give you that kind of freedom.
Yeah.
I mean, I always tried to be like the writers I admired, even though I was making documentaries. I think about all the people I've mentioned, but John Lee Anderson, Ryszard Kapuscinski, all those guys. I just imagined them going to the place where the revolution or the coup or the civil war was happening, getting to the right place that was right in the middle of it, and just hanging around, just hanging around for sometimes weeks and weeks and weeks, and not chatting to the general and the president, but chatting to the people, at the bottom underneath it all. And then you slowly figure out what the story actually is and how best to tell it. But like I said earlier, like going out there with a script in your head or on paper before is fatal to that approach.
Wow. Your story of the woman in Yemen is, I think, so encouraging. And, as much as there is a bunch of discouraging stuff when it comes to media and, everything that we've talked about as far as the negative aspects of it, that in itself is sort of such a beautiful thing, to give a voice to the people that are very much unheard, and even unheard by the news outlets that go over there to report on those stories, to imagine her sitting there and not.
And she was so passionate about it as well. It wasn't, her words were incredible, but it was the way she spoke as well. You could just tell that she was, I mean, I think at one point she actually said, we're literally just surviving with like 1% of what we actually need, but we're millimeters away from absolute catastrophe. And you could tell this was someone like right on the edge. And I mean, I'd urge people to watch it. I think if you Google, it's Vice News, obviously, in my name, and it's something like Yemen is currently one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. And the title of the film was A Living Hell. But if you Google the online news article, there was an extended version of the film, which we did, which was 30 minutes long. And she was given much more time. And it's just such a powerful thing to watch. And another example that I just thought of as I was telling that story, I was with the Marines who were part of Operation Mushtarak in Marja, which was, Obama had a big, tough 6-month policy review of the war in Afghanistan and decided on a new policy, counterinsurgency, and sent tens of thousands of Marines into this small farming district in Helmand called Marja, which was, where they were going to carry out this new policy and prove it could work and then take it elsewhere. And that's how they were going to turn around the war in Afghanistan and win the war in Afghanistan. I was with the Marines that were dropped into this town at 4 a.m. on day one, and they had to fight their way out for 3 days with nothing but their rifles. And it was like intense, day-long firefights. And the Marines I was with were really good and really, wanted to do the right thing and really cared about the Afghan civilians who lived in Marja. They had 0 civilian casualties despite these 3 or 4 days of intense fighting. And then another company came to support them called Charlie Company. And as they arrived, they fired a rocket into a house that they thought had a Taliban fighter in it, and they hit the wrong house and they killed a woman and 3 kids. Wow. And I said to the Marines, who at that point I'd spent 7 or 8 days with, and I'd literally spent days with them in ditches while they were getting shot at, and we slept in this bombed out old building on the floor. And I said, look, I know that after you kill civilians like this, you're going to have a meeting where you're going to apologize and you're going to give them a condolence payment. I would love to be there and film that meeting. And I was there on my own with a little handheld camera. And the guy said, yeah, sure, Ben, we'll come and get you. It's probably going to happen tomorrow morning at some point. So I said, great. And I honestly expected them to send me somewhere else or to say they forgot and leave me somewhere else and not let me film this meeting. But they came and got me. They led me into this meeting. And I filmed, I think it was a 3 or 4 hour meeting where these Marines who were, pretty much in tears, apologized to the family who they just killed three kids and a woman from this family. And the family were obviously distraught and angry, but sort of accepted the Marines' apology and their explanation for it. And then the Marines handed over $10,000 in local currency. It was $2,500 per person killed. And the father of the family kind of flinched as the money was brought out, but he took it and he put it in a little bag. And again, it was one of the most powerful things I think I've ever filmed. And it really did show the complexities of this kind of, modern counterinsurgency war. And there's no way I would have got that or even known that meeting was happening had I not spent 7 or 8 days with these guys before and really showed them that I wanted to show, the truth of what was going on, warts and all, good and bad, and was willing to go through whatever they were going through to do that. If I'd have just turned up that day, there's no way I would have got access to that incredible meeting.
Right. Wow. How does an experience like that, this one and the one we talked about previously, where it's very little conflict in the sense of you're not getting shot at. How does an experience like that, I guess, differentiate from ones where it is very intense and you are being shot at, and it's, in a way, I guess, more war correspondence that people would be more used to and maybe more exciting per se for some people? Does that experience almost, is it the same for you, or is it just as impactful, or is it more so?
Oh, more so. I mean, one of my favorite war correspondents of all time is Martha Gellhorn. And one of my favorite stories by her is she's talking about a hotel in, I think it's Barcelona, during the Spanish Civil War. And really all it is a piece about how this hotel is functioning despite the city being shelled. And she goes out one day and comes back, and one of the rooms has been shelled and everything inside it has been destroyed. And I think one of the waiters was killed. And it's one of the most powerful pieces of war reporting I've ever read. There's a great A.J. Liebling piece as well, where he's in a field in France with British fighter pilots. And they wake up in the morning and they have their tea or coffee and they have their, baked beans on toast. And then they fly out to have dogfights with the German fighter planes. And some of them don't come back. So he's not on the front lines. He's not in danger. But again, one of the most powerful pieces of war reporting I've ever come across. So I always think that the impact of war on civilians is the most important story. I try and get some of the fighting as well and spend some time with the fighters just to show what the conflict is actually like. But I hope the emphasis is always on the impact of war on civilians. That always seems like the more important thing to be doing. And all of the stuff I was talking about earlier with the PTSD makes you really review the way you've been working. And I think I was definitely guilty of just saying, where is the worst place to be? I need to be there. I need to spend a long amount of time there. And maybe there's a smarter way of covering war where you still get to interview that nurse in the child malnutrition clinic, for example, without having to spend a week or two with men shooting guns, because we all know what men shooting guns from trenches or from the back of trucks or whatever it looks like. Like who really cares? What matters is the impact it's having on civilians. So maybe there's a way of covering it, without actually being on the front lines in the thick of the actual fighting time and time again. I mean, you have to be in a place which is dangerous. And I mentioned some of my friends earlier who have been hurt or killed, and very often they weren't in the middle of some really intense firefight or operation somewhere. They were doing something which on the face of it looked fairly ordinary. They just happened to step in the wrong place and step on an IED, or they happened to be in a building where a stray shell landed, or they happened to take a wrong turn and someone kidnapped them. It's the sort of the physical danger side of this is often very hard to gauge, and you think that the big operation with hundreds of Marines and there's a massive firefight going on is the most dangerous place to be, and sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it's the ordinary stuff can get you in real trouble as well. Wow.
I guess another question I would ask for you, and if this is too personal, please let me know. The concept of numbness and, having that whole idea be something that's been, told to you several times, and something that I'm sure you've thought about this whole period of time since you've had treatment and therapy and different things. Has that improved in a way? Have you felt like, when you're able to come back from these stories, and even during these stories that are rather intense, do you feel like the amount of numbness and the emotions that you have, are they changing in a way from how they were previously?
It's changing slowly. I mean, the MDMA therapy was a huge help, but they claim something like a 70% success rate with veterans and first responders who have PTSD. And I think I was not in the 70% who are cured of PTSD. I'm not even sure exactly what a cure looks like. I think you learn to live with it rather than just do something and it goes away. Sure. So I'm sticking with traditional therapy, and it's I think there are breakthroughs, and I think I think you have to remind yourself of the little breakthroughs. But just, I mean, really, I can give you some really small examples of things that are beginning to happen that I don't think would have happened 4 years ago. I mean, when in New York, when everyone was doing the 7 p.m. applause to healthcare workers, I remember walking through the East Village at that time, and the applause had just died down. I turned a corner, and there was a young nurse walking towards me on the street, in medical scrubs. And I'm generally like quite introverted and can be quite shy, and in public and with strangers or with crowds. And I just naturally like gave her a little applause, like directly to her as we passed each other in the street. Mm-hmm. And she just kind of like smiled and nodded and seemed to appreciate it. And I almost had a slight tear in my eye just because there was this nice, genuine human interaction between strangers, and like a gesture of kindness that I was able to give freely and that was accepted. And that felt like a breakthrough. And it's a tiny thing. I've got friends who do things like that all day, every day with, all kinds of strangers and people in the car next door and all sorts. Mm. But little things like that did feel like a breakthrough. So there are signs and cracks, but it's definitely a slow process and a gradual process. And also, I think I'm somewhat different to the first responders and veterans who have been through this treatment in that I do intend to keep on going. I do intend to keep going back. So you've always got that as well. And maybe through self-protection or something, you're trying to keep yourself, I mean, you could call it hard and tough. I would say it's numb, but, maybe you're trying to keep yourself that way because you're knowing you're going to need it again. I don't know. It's still very much a work in progress, but yeah, definitely little signs of the numbness, chipping away at the numbness. But I mean, especially during the pandemic, I found some days you can have 3 or 4 good hours, when you're really enthusiastically thinking about things and making plans and reading books, and you can have at least as many, probably more bad hours when it's just very hard to care about anything or be motivated by anything. But I think that's probably what a lot of people are going through right now.
Sure. And you say you want to keep going back. Is that sort of the plan going forward? You want to continue to do these stories, or is there ever going to be, I guess it's hard to tell, but a period of time when you do, sell all your things and move to Costa Rica or Jamaica and kind of not necessarily abandon, but maybe retire the whole war correspondence thing and maybe just write and read and have a slower life?
Yeah, I mean, I think my fear, like I've got a real instinct to do exactly that right now. But I think my fear of that is it kind of feels like your interesting, useful, purposeful life is then over. But maybe it's worth doing something like that for 6 months or a year, and then see what's next. I mean, I'm working really hard right now to try and get a 4-part series commissioned, which is about war crimes, but it wouldn't involve going to active war zones. There'd be a bit of historical, retelling there and going to places where there was fighting a while ago. So it'll be interesting to see if that comes off, how satisfying that's going to be, how good I feel at doing that. Cause like I said before, sometimes I feel like my only skill is, kind of a stuntman. I'm just willing to go to these tough places and stick it out for longer than a lot of other people. And that's it. Sometimes I worry that that's the only skill I have. So it's going to be interesting to try and do something in different ways. But yeah, this is still, even on bad days, I think I still know that this is where my heart is. And I remember at the end of the first MDMA session, and I really thought the MDMA therapy, I did 3 sessions over 3 months. I really thought that might persuade me to say, okay, you've been doing it for 2 decades. You're lucky to be in one piece, like that. You've done enough. Retire and do something else. But I remember, 6 hours into the first session, I was having new ideas for documentaries and series, and I was excited by those ideas and wanting to get going on them. So I think this is always going to be what I most care about.
Sure. Do you I guess going forward, the accolades that you've received, whether it's Emmys and awards and various things like that, has that sort of been, how's that impacted you? I know for a lot of people who make, whether it's documentary films in general, TV shows, to receive an award like that would be sort of the pinnacle of success to them in a way that, they always dreamed of receiving something like that. For you, does those awards, do they hold as much weight, or are they something that is sort of just another little?
I mean, for the most part, no. I don't. For the most part, I couldn't give a toss, to be honest. I mean, I've seen some news pieces in particular that I thought were just awful win Emmys. So no. I mean, and I haven't really won personally. I've won a few for series I've worked on, or But some. I mean, even the Oscars. I mean, I guess that would be the pinnacle. Would be to win an Oscar for a feature-length documentary about something.
Sure.
But I mean, For Sama was nominated last year. There have been some really incredible documentaries nominated, and they gave it to the big American domestic documentary. So I don't know. Like I'm aware enough of the voting and how the voting works. I mean, if you work for a company who has some content nominated for an award, 9 times out of 10 that company will lobby all of its staff really hard to vote for the content that their company made. Mm-hmm. So that makes you very cynical and skeptical, and also it's a bit of an insider boys club, friends club, of friends voting for their friends and giving each other a slap on the back. And like I said, I've seen some awful stuff win Emmys, but then there have been some others. Like I won a Frontline Club award in London, and that really did feel like. I mean, John Lee Anderson was one of the judges. One of my heroes as a journalist. So that really meant a lot to me. I won the Prix Bayeux in France, and James Noctway handed over the award. I mean, that was incredible, because I really, even 20 years into my career, I really did think I still had another few levels to go before I was anywhere near on their levels. So to have people like that acknowledge your work and say they thought it was great, that really did mean a lot. But for the most part, no, I don't think awards mean very much. And then I also know people who have got tons of awards and they've never left their home.
Right. What does success look like for you then? If it's not awards or anything, is your definition of success, or something that you would genuinely consider? I mean, honestly, I don't know. It's something that because of all the things we've been talking about that are going on right now, that I think is changing often. I mean, I think probably at the start of my career, I would have thought, that you do a war, that you do a documentary or write a book that leads to like real serious change. You get the tobacco companies to admit they were lying for years about how they knew that tobacco was addictive. I'm told that one of my Yemen films played quite a role in getting the Senate and Congress to vote against, supplying arms to Saudi Arabia unconditionally. But of course, Trump then vetoed that bill. So little things like that here and there. I also think that I thought that I'd keep on doing what I was doing, and it would be tough and intense and exhausting, but I'd keep on doing that for decades. And then at some point I would exhaust myself so much that at the age of, 60 or 65, I'd suddenly collapse into a rocking chair and just think, okay, you really went for it, and you pushed as hard as you could, and you fought as hard as you could, and you made as much as you could for 4 decades, and now you're completely spent and you're done, and you can retire, happy and satisfied. But I don't know. I don't know if I can do it in the way I've been doing it for another 20 years. I mean, the next step might be to try and help the next generation of people doing this. And one of the things which has weirdly happened in the pandemic is lots of people have been reaching out, and I would always just ignore, whenever I got nice messages on Instagram or Twitter or by email or whatever, I'd kind of, sometimes I wouldn't even look at them or read them. I thought there was something dangerous about reading compliments from people, and I've actually made it a habit of once every couple of weeks just to sit down and really read them and reply or send a voice message and here and there just help people. I mean, I remember when I started out, when I wrote my book, I sent it to 10 of my journalistic heroes, and John Lee Anderson wrote back straight away. Wow.
With a lovely blurb for the book. John Pilger, who I think has lost his mind recently, but when I was like 17, 18, I thought was brilliant. He sent me a little passport photo of himself, weirdly, with a little message and a signature on the back, and told me to buy a couple of books and subscribe to a couple of magazines, and that meant the world to me. I'm not saying I'm John Lee Anderson or what John Pilger was then, but yeah, maybe that's the next thing is you kind of think, well, it's not all on my shoulders anymore. I'm gonna help the next generation do it.
Yeah, definitely. And I am, very grateful for this conversation and interview, and it has impacted me in a big way.
Thank you.
I guess I would wonder what you would say to like a 17, 18-year-old version of yourself if you can, after years of everything that you've done, which is just a massive list of, amazing work. Would you, I guess, I don't know, what would you say to that young Ben Anderson who, is somewhat shy about his love and admiration for journalism and wanting to get into a field and maybe being apprehensive in a way?
I mean, I think what I'd say, and what I have said to a few people recently is when I was 17 or 18, and when I discovered these books for the first time, like my curiosity was just so high, and my love for these ideas and these stories and these methods of telling stories was so pure that like the path forward just became obvious, and one thing led to the next thing, which led to the next thing, and just if you've got those qualities, like I'm not sure how much you can teach people the basic rules of journalism and editing and copywriting and everything else fairly easily. Apart from that, I think the real skills you need as a journalist is endless curiosity, stamina and energy for the work, a bit of physical courage if you're going to do the kind of stuff we've been talking about. But those things can't really be taught. And if you've got those things, if you've got those instincts inside you, then just pay attention to them, because they are so strong and so smart. And your instincts as a good, curious, empathetic human being will show you how to tell stories and what questions to ask, and what's important and what isn't important. And it's very easy to forget that. There's an old is it Emerson or H.G. Thoreau? I forget. He basically said that everyone has a genius within them somewhere. You just have to find that voice and be able to listen to that voice. And I think if you do that and you pay attention to it so much that you're willing to go off in all kinds of crazy tangents and go off in all kinds of crazy directions. I mean, one of the books I love, and it's not really journalism, but Oliver Sacks's memoir, On the Move. His is a great example of a life that no one could have ever predicted. But because he just followed his curiosity and his brilliance and his knowledge and his empathy wherever it took him over the course of it. I mean, he came out as gay when he was, I think, 17 or 18 years old. And his family just shunned him and ostracized him completely. So he left England and went to New York and had a crazy 6 months on the gay scene in New York. Then he was celibate for, I think, 30 years until he met the love of his life. Wow. But in those 30 years, he became almost like a world-class weightlifter at Venice Beach. He became a free swimmer where he's swimming in wild, rivers and lakes all over the world. He ran basically an insane asylum in New York and completely transformed it to be a place that was basically imprisoning people to a place that was actually helping people. And that became Awakenings, the movie with Robin Williams. He experimented with psychedelics every Sunday in his Greenwich Village apartment years before, lots of people were talking about the potential benefits of psychedelics. He wrote, 8 or 9 brilliant books. Became one of my favorite New Yorker writers. Had he at any point have paid attention to what he was supposed to do or what he was supposed to stick to or what he was supposed to do next, he wouldn't have done most of those things. So I think one of the great things about a career in journalism is, I went to university. I was one of the first members of my family ever to go to university, and I was so hungry to study and learn and share ideas, and it wasn't that at all when I went, and I hated it, and I quit after the first year, and kind of got despondent, and then had to spend 1 or 2 years going off the rails before I got back into my love of books. But all of that is to say, just if you can pay attention to that thing that your heart is telling you really care about and that you think is really important, don't go and interview the prime minister of that country. Find that nurse in that child malnutrition clinic who's going to tell you what it's really like for people on the front lines of this problem, dealing with this crisis. Then, and also don't think that because you've got a job as a writer or a photographer or an editor or a documentary maker, like that's what you've got to stick to. So in terms of the medium and the story you're covering, I probably could, let's say Trump wins a second term, I could probably spend those 4 years covering Trump, which would probably be a fascinating thing to travel. I could probably cover Trump's financial crimes. I could probably cover prison reform in the US. The lack of mental health help available for the homeless in America, the healthcare. There's all kinds, and you can almost reinvent yourself and your life like every few years based on what you're interested in or based on what's happening. And how many professions are there where you can do that? You can basically design your own university course each year. I'm sorry, that's why I mentioned my bad experience at university, because if you're in the right place as a journalist, you can basically design your own university course every year. And whatever it is that interests you or that you think is important at that time, you can read everything that's ever been written about it. You can talk to some of the leading players in that field. You can come up with your own theory about what needs to be done. You can travel to the countries that are most important to whatever it is whatever issue it is you're covering. So if you stay open-minded and willing to just listen to your curiosity as much as possible, then it can be a fantastic life. And I talked earlier about wanting to help or wanting to make the world a better place in some way, and all of those cliches. There's also a selfish reason for doing that, and it's just it can be just a really educational, wide-ranging, endlessly interesting life, especially if you want to cover the rest of the world and travel the world.
Yeah. Wow. That's very well said. I think that's great. And I also share a similar path in the concept of going to school and then sort of not liking it and going off the rails a little bit and then coming back and finding a true passion for it. But I think that's a very important thing too, is just to always, have that curiosity and that passion and everything. So I appreciate you saying that. As we
Sorry. And the best writers, I think, Martha Gellhorn, like I said, George Orwell, they maintained that forever. Like no matter what happened, no matter how old they got, no matter what they'd seen, no matter how much success they got, you can still feel in every sentence they just really cared for people and people's stories.
Right. That's amazing. And Martha Gellhorn, for people that don't know, that was she covered Spanish War. She was with Hemingway for a while, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, one of my favorite books of hers. My favorite is probably The Face of War, but she wrote a sort of memoir called Travels with Myself and Another. And the another was Ernest Hemingway, and she couldn't bring herself to name him because she hated him so much by the time she came to write the memoir. Wow. And she covered the Chinese front with Japan in World War II. And the way she describes it is she went through hell to get to the front line and see what was going on. Mm-hmm. And he stayed back in, I forget which city it was, just getting drunk with old important generals. And she basically makes him look like a complete fraud, and certainly next to her.
Wow. It's amazing. It's interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think Hemingway also started out, he has a book called Byline, which is his early journalistic stories and stuff, which
Yeah.
And a lot of,
and there's one of Adam, I think, is it Adam Hochschild's most recent book? I think it's his most recent book called Spain in Our Hearts, about Americans who volunteered in the Spanish Civil War. I think everyone, like King Leopold, Adam Hochschild's last 4 books, Bury the Chains, about the English abolitionist movement, To End All Wars, about the World War I and the anti-war activists there. King Leopold's Ghost, I think, is like one of the greatest nonfiction books ever written. And Spain in Our Hearts opens with this story of these 2 volunteer fighters who are fleeing the fascists, and they're running, they're starving, their clothes have been almost ripped off them. They crawl across this icy cold river and get cut, and the clothes get ruined further, and they crawl out the other side and they find a road, and the fascists are close behind them. And whichever car comes around the corner first is going to decide their fate. If it's pro-fascist, they're dead. They're going to be arrested and tortured and killed. If it's anti-fascist, they might escape. And the car pulls around, and the guys inside say, "Get in," and they give them the blanket and they drive off. And one of them is Hemingway.
Wow. Amazing.
And it's just, and as soon as I read that, I'm like, okay, now I know I'm in the hands of a master. This is Adam Hochschild, like at his best. Like, what a story to open with.
That's so great. How do you say his name again? Or how do you spell it, I guess? Adam.
Yeah, I'll spell it for you. It's Hochschild. So Adam Hochschild, I think is how you, or Hochschild, I think is how you pronounce it.
Perfect. Yeah, I think we mentioned quite a few books. I would love to get like a list of them. All of them seem very interesting, but I'm going to definitely dive into him first. It seems like the way to go.
Oh, I mean, King Leopold's Ghost. I must have bought that 15 times and given it to people. It's just unbelievable, and it kind of backs up what I was saying earlier. I mean, I think I'm remembering this right. In the Adam read something about Belgian Congo and it being King Leopold's state rather than a colony. His own private state. And he looked it up in the encyclopedia and it said something like, when King Leopold took over Congo, the population was 20 million. And by the time it became a colony, he gave it up as a private state, and the population was 10 million. And he was like, hang on a minute, what? Like, what happened where he halved the population? And there's a story in it of a guy called, I forgot his name now. E.D. Malloy, I think his name is, who was basically a shipping clerk in Liverpool in England. And he would see these boats coming in with ivory and rubber on them, and then the boats going out contained weapons. And after a few years, he thought, I need to find out what the fuck is happening in Congo. And he found out what's happening and started campaigning against it. And then eventually Mark Twain and others got involved. And again, that's the perfect example of what I'm talking about with great journalists. Sometimes it can be something as simple as reading one sentence in an encyclopedia. And you think, wait a minute, what happened where the population was halved from 20 million down to 10 million? Wow. And that led to what I think is one of the greatest nonfiction books of all time. That's the kind of curiosity and individuality of thinking that I'm referring to.
Yeah, it's amazing. Is that something that you would consider doing, writing and maybe taking a step back from documentary filmmaking and writing books? I know you wrote the book on Afghanistan.
I would love to. I've got a real, because my whole career I've only reported on things or talked about things or written about things that I've actually witnessed with my own eyes. So I would love to do a book like King Leopold's Ghost, but it's quite a hard concept to get my head around that I could just rely on other secondary sources and other books and even, if you can get your hands on all kinds of original documents and stuff, it's a very different skill set. And I like the feeling of, like you said something earlier about when you're showing things, it's incontrovertible evidence. Like I like the feeling of saying, okay, like here's footage of a guy on drugs with a young boy as a servant, bragging about how he sexually assaults that young boy at night. That is irrefutable evidence. There's no art to it. There's no creative genius to it. I don't claim I'm a wonderful filmmaker or director or with the writing. Don't claim I'm an amazing writer. It's just hard evidence that you cannot refute. Like that's what excites me, and that's what I like trying to do. So I don't know. I'd love to be able to write a book 10% as good as King Leopold's Ghost. I don't know if I could do it. And the other thing I'd say to young aspiring journalists is just figure out what you're good at, because you will spend years working your arse off and working yourself to exhaustion with probably very little in return. So it's got to be something that actually doesn't feel like work. And if your passion is to go through hundreds of documents trying to find those few little nuggets of information, then do that. If your passion is just really getting out to the far reaches of the world and getting to the toughest, most remote places, then do that. If your passion is interviewing people, is whatever it is you think you could just do. I mean, I always used to say to people, when you've finished work and you go home and you've had your dinner and you've done all your everyday things, like when you've got that hour or two free at night, what is it you're spending time on? And for me, I was reading about Gaza and Congo and Israel, Palestine and Afghanistan. And so that showed me, which way to go. And so in terms of other advice for young aspiring journalists, just it's fairly easy, I think, to figure out what you'll be good at and what you'll be able to do for a very long periods of time, maybe without much reward. And I would stick to that.
Wow, awesome, man. Well, I guess as we wrap up there, do you have any like ways where people can find you and look at your work, and any, I know you've done a ton of films. If there's any, I know the Yemen one is one that you recommend people to check out. I guess it's weird to, recommend your own work or whatever, but if you want to, just where people can find you, check out your stuff, and, some top ones that you would recommend people checking out.
Yeah, no, I don't have a page or anything. If you just type in my name and whatever country you're interested in, there's a bunch of stuff on YouTube. There is, there must be 30 or 35 films on HBO and Showtime. I'm proud of the book, No Worst Enemy. I'm proud of the 2 feature documentaries I did, The Battle for Marja, which was on HBO, but I'm pretty sure it was on YouTube. This Is What Winning Looks Like, which is the one I talked about with the Afghan police justifying child abuse. That's on YouTube. That's about it. I'm not really on social media, but when I am, I'll put out a picture or a tweet sharing recent work. Burkina Faso, I think, was the last one. So Ben John Anderson, if you want to get one tweet every 3 months from me about what I've been up to, then that's a good way to find some stuff. But yeah, I really probably should. That's probably one of the many things I should have done during COVID is organize a page where everything's in one place. There were so many things I planned to do. Like I'm a terrible typer. I type with fingers and thumbs, like index fingers and thumbs, and that's it. And one of the things I swore I'd do during quarantine was learn how to type, and I haven't yet done it. I start doing it and I get annoyed, just go back to single finger typing. But it just reminded me of something else on the to-do list I didn't get to.
Right on. Well, Ben, I appreciate your time, man. Thank you so much for sitting down with me. It's an absolute pleasure.
Pleasure. Great talking to you as well.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of The Double Life. If you want to see more of Ben's work, you can follow him at Ben John Anderson on Instagram and Twitter. You can also head to YouTube and check out all the documentaries he's done, as well as picking up his book, No Worst Enemy. You can follow us at The Double Life Pod. Make sure to subscribe and tell your friends. Adios.